day, and welcome to Election Watch at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm here with my colleague, Chris Stirewalt. Election Watch is the longest-running election commentary series in Washington, starting in 1982. We have one of our founders, Carlin Bowman, in the audience tonight. We have a great panel today. I'm going to let Chris tell you about them, but we're going to talk. We're going to have some questions from you, and we're going to talk all about what happened in the midterm election 2 days ago. So, Chris.
Now, was that something, or what? And the introduction, yes, but also, I'm still kind of can't believe all that happened in this election. I think the most important takeaway is that I was right about most things, and I think that's what we should really marinate in. That's the key part. No. This was, the stakes of the election were relatively low as a midterm election, but the amount of information and what was revealed about the electorate was extraordinarily high. We know a lot more than we did before, and we could not have better people to talk about it with. We are extraordinarily lucky today. If you do not know him already, Whit Ayers is a leading Washington, D.C. I'm going to fact check this card as we go. He is a leading Washington, D.C. political consultant for more than 30 years, with experience in polling and survey research and high-profile political campaigns and association. This checks out. He is the author of 2016 and Beyond, which draws upon his years of campaign experience and decades of polling trends to illustrate the ways in which new candidates, new messages, and a new tone can help Republicans win the presidency in the new America. You can tell he's Republican by his necktie. We appreciate him wearing a very Republican necktie today so that you can tell. As founder and president of North Star Opinion Research, Whit provides message development, advice, and strategic insights to high-level political clients. He founded his company after a career as tenured professor in the department. I did not know this. A tenured professor in the Department of Government and International Studies at the University of South Carolina. I thought you were just like the rest of us making it up as we went along. Here you are knowing stuff.
Well, I may be, Chris.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Well, we'll see how it goes.
All right.
Okay, now Rui Teixeira also accommodated us by not wearing a necktie at all, so you know he's a Democrat. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, yay, where he focuses on the transformation of party coalitions and the future of American electoral politics. Before joining AEI, he was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress from 2003 to 2022, which I say is not since the Yankees got Babe Ruth from the Red Sox have we had a better trade with a rival organization. He is the co-author of The Emerging Democratic Majority, which was selected as one of the best books of the year by The Economist. Co-author of a series of reports called States of Change, which detail the impact of demographic changes on political parties. His forthcoming book is Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. But two things I will also tell you about Rui is his, we don't call it a blog, it's a Substack.
Substack, yeah.
It'd be cool, it's Substack. We're not wearing neckties. His Substack, The Liberal Patriot, should be required reading. It is excellent, and we could not be more fortunate to have these two with us today who have clear-eyed views of their own parties and a real love of country. So we are lucky to have you guys today. We've all sort of taken a little speciality here, and John Fortier, the great John Fortier, is going to tell us what in the heck happened in the representatives for the House of Representatives.
Thank you, Chris. Let me mention one other logistical detail. So we are going to talk and have some conversation among ourselves, and then we're going to go to your questions. So for those in the audience, you should be ready. There'll be a microphone. And for those watching from afar, you can either email your questions to nate.moore@aei.org or with the hashtag on Twitter, AEI Election Watch. I think I have that right. Okay, so let's talk about the House. Nobody's interested in the House. Nothing happened there. Before doing that, I do want to step back and know one historical note. And on election night, Tuesday, we had the death of a very famous person in election studies, David Butler, the British, some ways, inventor of the term psephology, if you know that term, meaning someone who studies elections, someone who was on the BBC broadcast for many years, was also a friend of AEI. In fact, you can find books in our library where David Butler and some of our scholars at the time did some things in the late 70s. The reason I bring up David Butler, one, is because he should be honored as somebody who studied elections, but two, he was famous for introducing to television the swingometer. The swingometer was if you watch old YouTube videos from the 50s and 60s on the BBC, a pretty primitive looking thing. It looked a little like Nate Cohn's dial, but made of cardboard. And he showed how, sort of a natural swing from in one direction or not would have real consequences across the electorate, not just race by race. That never caught on the swingometer part here, but I think that's something we should think about. What was swing in this election? How much did it swing? Why did it not swing as much as maybe some of us thought? And also, I think in some ways it was a weird election, and there were some very strong swings in the other direction in some places, while swings were going on in one way. So let's start with what I think some of you were here. I was here a few weeks ago, and I have, I suppose, a bit of a mea culpa. Many people in Washington do. It looked as if we were going to see a stronger Republican trend. And what I would say is the fundamentals, as we sometimes call them, looked pretty good for Republicans. It's a midterm election, and President Biden was at a low level of approval. Pick whatever number you want. It's an average, but 43% for incumbent president usually leads to some pretty bad results in the midterm elections, especially in the House of Representatives for the party in the White House. And I guess I laid out what I thought was at the time a really good night for Democrats would be if they lost only 15 seats in the House of Representatives. That would put them at about, Republicans at about 228 with the majority. Well, Democrats had a really, really good night by that standard. We don't know what the final numbers are going to be, and I think the likelihood is that Republicans are still going to take the House, but because I'm saying the likelihood, it means that there's a little bit of uncertainty, that we're in much lower territory for Republican gains than we had anticipated.
John, can you give a number of what you think it'll wind up?
Well, I was going to say I think where we are is somewhere in a good remaining days, and that means counting a lot of votes, especially in California, is probably more like 224 or 225 for Republicans. That would be on the high side. I think more in the median is more like a low 220s. That's a 8-seat majority or so. But the low side starts to flirt with 218, and I think it would take a lot for Democrats to get there, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. What I would say is there's certainly a number of races out there. The big wild card, well, almost all the races out there that we're really wondering about are big vote-by-mail states, especially California, but also some seats in Washington, Oregon, Arizona. There's a seat in Colorado people are interested in too, although that's less dependent on mail at this point. Most of the mail is in, but those may take quite a long time. If California is just radically different than we think, is more, a lot more Democratic coming in the mail, that's when I think that low estimate for Republicans might come into play, where you might say, maybe they're not going to keep the House. With that, as many of you know, a very close House, whether it's even if Republicans have 222 or 3, that's a very narrow margin, and that's a very narrow margin for a speakership election. Kevin McCarthy has done a lot of work shoring up his troops, but the speakership election is one that only requires not a majority of your caucus, but a majority of the House, and so even 7 or 8 rebellious members might be able to undo what Kevin McCarthy has tried to do. So I'm not predicting that, but arguably the closer that election is, the closer the margins are, the more of a tense leadership election we might have. And if for some reason the Democrats held the House, I would expect it would be by 1 or 2 seats. You would also have the same on the other side. So what about swing? Well, so why did we not move as far in the Republican direction as we thought? Well, I guess you could point to a lot of reasons, but one point is that Republicans actually did have a swing in their direction. They moved. Joe Biden won the popular vote by 4.5 points. We don't know the final margin of the House popular vote because again we're waiting on California, but it's likely to be a Republican majority, maybe by a point, point and a half a point. People are making different estimates, but that's a 5 or 6 point swing, perhaps. I think what we can look at is that we were expecting not a much larger swing, but just a little bit larger swing, and that would have made a lot of difference. And I'll say, if you just looked at the House of Representatives and said, what if Republicans won all the seats that would be encompassed by a 5-point swing? They would have 224 seats. That's kind of where we're going to be. We're around that territory, and that's roughly the kind of swing that we saw. A 7-point swing, again, leaving aside incumbency and just everybody loses under 7 points, would be about 233 seats. And an 8.5-point swing, which would mean Republicans winning the ballot by 3.5 points or so, coming from 4.5 in the other direction. That would be about 246 seats, a 30-seat gain. That's the kind of range that we were talking about. And so while it doesn't seem dramatic, just Republicans having a wave, which it is a wave, they definitely moved in the Republican direction, moved about 5 seats, and just the number of 5 points, and just the number of seats that were not there because they only moved there rather than moving 7 or 7.5 points was very significant. So with that, there wasn't an even swing, and many of you, of course, know this. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, but surprisingly, the amount of it, Florida and New York were extremely Republican. The Republicans did incredibly well. And just to put some numbers on it, essentially Republicans gained, both states, one lost a seat and one gained a seat, but they gained 3 or 4 seats in each case, and a net between the two of them of 7 seats. That's the difference in the election out there. If Republicans hadn't done as well on election night, and if redistricting, both in New York and Florida, hadn't gone as well as it did ultimately, where it looked like it would go worse, we would be talking about a Democratic House, almost certainly. So 2 big pushes in 2 states where most of the gains that Republicans are going to see are going to come essentially from those 2 states. In the other direction, of course, Democrats were doing a little bit better than expected in a lot of places, but they did really well in some places. I look at Michigan, where both at, I'm not going to talk about the other races as much, but certainly at the state level races, but in the House races as well. There obviously was a ballot question on abortion in Michigan. People have to look at that and see if that's the reason, but Michigan is a place. And broadly speaking, across the Midwest, Republicans didn't do so well. You can point to some exceptions, but in the House especially, lots of seats that they might have picked up, seats that were Trump seats even, they went right past, and the incumbents kept those seats, and Republicans weren't winning in those places. And finally, there were a few incumbents that Republicans knocked off, but incumbency seems to have been a great barrier also. I mean, incumbency is always an advantage and keeps people in seats that they might not otherwise win. But if you look at it, and I don't think we have a final number, but we have about 4 incumbents that Republicans have knocked off. And the number that they could have that were sitting in Trump seats, people like Jared Golden in Maine or Matt Cartwright in Pennsylvania, actually Mary Peltola, partly for structural reasons, is very likely to survive in Alaska, the most Republican seat. That is also something that sort of kept back this tide. So I think at the end of the day, we saw a swing, a real swing for Republicans, but that swing was just being a little bit smaller than expected, just didn't pick up enough seats. And you saw some strength in incumbency, you saw some strength in Democrats in the Midwest, and Republicans should be thankful that they had some real big wins in New York and Florida, which actually are probably the things that are going to get them the majority by a narrow margin.
So what was redistricting worth in the end?
Well, I think if you looked across the country in advance, it was not worth very much. It was probably worth 2 or 3 seats. You had lots of pluses and minuses, but interestingly, when you looked at New York and Florida, right, Ron DeSantis, governor, before the election, pushed for a much more Republican map, and it was unclear whether that would go through. And that map, plus his performance, the Republicans' performance, both. I mean, there were 2 big factors that helped in Florida and New York, where the court actually pulled back the more strong Democratic map, plus good Republican performance. So. Again, I still think it's nets out to 2 or 3 seats probably in the Republican direction, but I think if you combine with the other factors in those 2 states, it's a huge factor.
Now, I know it's too soon to say because, as you say, there's a bajillion votes out in California, but what do we think the turnout is going to have been like?
Yeah, so the story of turnout has been that the last two elections have been our highest turnout ever, but putting those aside, even before that, in the four presidential elections starting in 2004 up to 2016, we'd had our highest turnout. I know we have a bunch of Danes in the audience, and my mother's Danish, and Danes blow us away in terms of turnout. We can never compete with Scandinavians. We're not that high. But for us, we've done very, very well. And in 2018 was the highest turnout for a midterm election in modern history, about 50%. Highest turnout for a presidential election, about 67-ish% in 2020. It looks like we're going to end up 48% or so, which would be the second highest, so very high, but not quite the 2018 numbers that we saw.
Okay, well now, let's hear about the Senate. Having heard about the House, let's talk about the United States Senate. Rui, what do you know?
Okay, well, here's what I know right now. I mean, obviously, they're still counting the votes in a lot of cases. Some of these races haven't been called, but...
Yeah, we'll interrupt for any race calls. If Rui has any race calls to make, we'll interrupt.
But my overarching take on Republican performance in general in these races, I think they had very legitimate expectations of taking back the Senate. Looks like it didn't happen. And I think it's all about candidate quality, Trumpy candidates, crazy candidates, weak candidates, incompetent candidates, all the kind of candidates you don't want running in a competitive seat if you hope to take that seat from the other party. So let's kind of review the bidding here. The 6 seats people talked most about were 2 that Democrats wanted to flip and 4 that Democrats had to hold. So Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, New Hampshire, and Nevada. So in Pennsylvania, where now it is, we've called both these races, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. In Pennsylvania, Fetterman does quite well against a really bad candidate, really bad candidate. Look at Arizona, bad candidate. Georgia, bad candidate. New Hampshire, bad candidate. So basically the Republicans sort of were trying to win these races with, sort of a foot race with both feet tied together. It didn't work. In Pennsylvania, Fetterman's victory, I mean, I tried to look a little bit at the internals of the AP North Votecast, which I recommend to you as a fantastic data source and better, in my opinion, significantly better than the exit polls on which people tend to rely. And now the Votecast just started up in 2018, so at least now we have 2018, 2020, and 2022 as a time series, which allows for some interesting comparisons. So I was looking at that, and one thing that was interesting about Pennsylvania is that the non-white working class, non-white, non-college voters actually did far worse for Fetterman than they did for Biden. It was like over a 20-point decline in the Democratic advantage among those voters, where Fetterman really did relatively well compared to Biden was among white working class voters. So it seems like the weird candidate that the Republicans nominated really did hurt them among that demographic. And in general, Fetterman had a relatively easy time winning. In Wisconsin, you had a little bit of the reverse candidate quality problem. Mandela Barnes was not at all the Democrats' vote maximizing candidate. It was pretty easy to pillory as a weak on crime candidate and otherwise too far left. In Wisconsin, it looks like the non-white vote held up pretty well for the Democrats, but the white vote went south, both white college and white non-college. And that's why Johnson was able to eke out a victory. Arizona, it hasn't been called yet, but everybody's, people who look at the outstanding ballots and where they're coming from and so on, tend to believe that Mark Kelly will win and actually win fairly easily. So why did he win? Again, he's running as a terrible candidate, just an awful candidate. And he did, in fact, wind up soundly beating them. And here it looks like the big change is the Hispanic vote held up for the Democrats, but what really changed in a big way and contributed to Kelly's victory was that white college graduates had a strong swing in the direction of the Democrats in this election. And I think it's that primarily to which he'll owe the larger margin he's going to receive, probably, in this race compared to how Biden did in 2020. Georgia, it basically looks like they held serve. I mean, you had this terrible candidate, Herschel Walker, running against, Raphael Warnock is a very strong, competent Democrat. He doesn't come across as crazy, really, at all. And basically what happened is the parties just went like this, and it wound up being basically the same kind of race that Biden ran in 2020, and now it's going to go to a runoff. I think the expectation there is that the Democrats will take this seat, but as we'll see in just a second, it doesn't really matter that much, probably, and that's because of Nevada. Nevada, Cortez, what's her name again?
Masto.
Cortez Masto. CCM is how I prefer to say it. CCM looks like she'll hold on, even though Laxalt is ahead now by like 1.5 or 1.6 points. Again, looking at the outstanding ballots and where they are, they're heavily urban. Most people who look at this closely think that, in fact, CCM will eke out the victory. And in that case, the runoff in Georgia isn't going to matter that much. I mean, it'll matter, 51-49 or 50-50, but the Democrats will still control the Senate, and I tend to believe that's likely. New Hampshire, again, a seat that Republicans thought they would have a good chance of taking, but again, a really bad candidate, and ably assisted by the Democratic Party in this case, which is kind of interesting thing to chew on, because they wanted to run against Bolduc. They did, and they won. Broad brush across these races, we see that a lot of Republican underperformance in these races can be attributed to the inability to sort of nominate replacement level candidates, right? Just averagely good candidates in these races. Instead, through the intervention of Trump and the general weirdness in the Republican Party, they nominated perhaps their vote minimizing candidates in most of these races, and surprise, surprise, they lost. Even though the Democrats were not in particularly good odor in a lot of these states, it was in way better order than some of these candidates were. So very broad brush, super broad brush, 30,000 feet. We're now on unstable equilibrium in American politics between the Democratic and Republican Party has been ratified in spades. I mean, super closely divided Senate, super closely divided House. Voters don't really like either party very much. But in terms of the candidates that were put forward in this election, they generally tended to see the Democratic candidates as less extreme, even though they see both parties as about equally extreme overall. But the candidates, this was an interesting survey that was done by Third Way before the election, candidates were viewed as being more extreme overall and by swing voters in this election, which again ties into this candidate quality problem. So what does this mean for the future in terms of the Republican and Democratic parties moving into the 2024 election cycle? I think, oddly enough, I think this may be good for the Republicans because the voices are rising to a crescendo in the Republican Party about this isn't working. Trump is not a winner, and Trumpy politics is not a winner, and the kind of candidates he favors are not winners. We've got to change. We need to do something differently. This will not pass. So I think while Trump is going to be hard to get out of the way, and the kind of candidates, I mean, there's going to be real impetus there to change the approach of the Republican Party and move to the center in some critical ways, and above all, nominate, competent candidates who can compete effectively in elections, and obviously that wasn't Trump's highest priority. People are sick of it. We'll see what happens with that. But on the other hand, I look at the Democrats, and my take on what they're going to do different is, as Joe Biden so eloquently put it, nothing.
Nothing.
I mean, they figured, hey, everybody thought we'd get our clock clean. We didn't get our clock clean. We have a relatively good election in the midterms. What's the need to change? Even though they hate our party, they hate Biden, they think the economy's in the toilet and the country's off on the wrong track, and they think we're too far to the left on a bunch of cultural issues. No problem. We did great. Nothing needs to change going forward. And I think that the impetus, the moderates in the party might have had to push the party to the center on a lot of these issues, is really going to be undercut by this election result. And I think the progressives are in full force, the left of the party advocating this was a fantastic victory. We mobilized our people. They love our program. They love our legislation. Even though most voters don't really know what it is or understand it, but they trust us, they love us, and we can just cruise into 2024 and beat the hell out of Trump, who they hope is the nominee, which is something that I wrote about in my Substack this morning, is it's really rather appalling the way Democrats so obviously are rooting for Trump to be the candidate now. They do not want to run against Ron DeSantis or Glenn Youngkin or someone like that. They want to run against Trump because they think they can beat him, and they want to run against Trumpy candidates because they can beat them. But these are the same people who, out of the other side of the mouth, talk about how we're 3 seconds from fascism, democracy's on the ballot, we've got to preserve our wonderful democratic system against the Hitlerite, the sort of legions at the door. So, I mean, which is it? Come on. It seems to me like if you really care about the health of democracy, you do not want Trump to run in 2024. You do not want those kind of candidates, and you want to run against like actual competent candidates who respect the basic rules of the game. But that therefore means that the Democrats might have to change more than they.
I want to ask you more about that.
Okay.
But I want to take the temperature of the other two folks up here. You said that you thought that the Democrats would be favored to win in the Georgia runoff. John, do you think that's true?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's a different dynamic if it's for the Senate or not, right? And so I think Rui's generally right. We're leaning towards it not being decisive.
Right.
I actually don't think, the one thing we had in the last election was, Trump making a mess and continuing.
Telling people not to vote in the runoff may have been harmful to Republican chances?
Just continuing sense of the direction of the election or wanting to send a message to Trump. I mean, we don't have that here. And so I guess I think it's somewhat more of a neutral election than it was in 2020.
Whit, you know about runoffs. Republicans in Georgia tend to win runoffs. Republicans like runoffs in states where they are the overwhelming majority because the voter motivation gets harder, the electorate shrinks, it's hard to get lower income, younger voters to go twice. Do you think Democrats would be favored in a Georgia runoff?
Our first major race was Paul Coverdell
There you
in a
go.
runoff in 1992, where he came back from being 1 point down to Weich Fowler, gained a couple of points, and won by 1 point 2 days before Thanksgiving. This is a different environment. I think it's just a coin flip. I mean, it looks for all the world like an even shot, and I think you flip a coin and see which one wins.
I have to think it's the Republicans, but what do I know? I think they revert to partisanship type and the electorate shrinks. But I agree with you that if it was for the Senate, you'd have to recalculate. And any Georgians watching, I just want to say I'm so sorry for what you're going to have to endure after having $250 million dropped on your head in attack ads and dumb mailers. Get ready for the last 100 million more. I'm going. And Rui, I do want to ask you. Democrats propped up a bunch of real dirtbag candidates around the country. Some of them were kooks, some of them were grifters, but who were, and the term now is the election deniers, that these deniers around the country. From a cold-eyed point of view, they succeeded. All of those candidates lost, right?
Yeah, I mean, it succeeded in raw, brutal, cynical, short-term electoral terms. I disapprove of it on a sort of basic good government, pro-democracy, our society stance. And I also think it's a bit fool's gold in the sense that you can prop up these guys and you can, now the Republican Party has really gotten the message that it needs to change. And you're not in a position where you can effectively campaign against the other party, I think. The other party, the Republicans sort of know what you're up to at this point. And they realize that these kind of candidates don't work too well, and therefore we should not run those type of candidates. So I think that in the end, this may turn out not to work out so well for the Democrats. But I mean, in the very short term, I think it's been a winner.
But Chris, it's cynical as all get out. I mean, you either believe in democracy or you don't.
Yeah.
Peter Meyer was one of the good guys. He was one of the ones who had the guts to vote to impeach Donald Trump. The Democrats intervened in his primary, got some right-wing guy to beat him in the primary, and yes, the Democrats won the seat. But now one of the people who are helping to make the system work is gone from the House.
That's right.
Because
That's another
of the
side effect.
Democratic intervention in a primary. And I'm
the
sorry,
loss of goodwill.
You either believe in democracy or you don't.
Can I just quickly go back to candidate quality, which I think broadly is true, but I do think that there were some limitations on this. There were obviously two super candidates out there that we would be talking about a Republican majority had they run. That is Governor Sununu and Governor Ducey in New Hampshire and Arizona. They were about as good a candidate as you can get. You don't always have those options. And you think about Pennsylvania, where there hasn't been a bench of statewide office holders. It's a big state. A House member represents a very small part of the state. And then you see candidates. I mean, I see candidates like Ron Johnson. And I know some people could question whether they think he's a good candidate or not, but he's an incumbent. He's won elections against strong people. Not doing as well either. And so I think candidate quality was something, but there was also some trends that pushed down some of the numbers of people who were more traditional candidates. Also, Adam Laxalt in Nevada.
A good opportunity to talk about that, about John's excellent point, will be as I take you on a quick romp through gubernatorial elections and some referenda on the ballots around the country. We'll do the referenda first, which is that Arkansas, North Dakota, South Dakota don't like weed. Missouri and Maryland, light them up. They're on their way. So that ratchet effect around the country with recreational marijuana continues, much like sports gambling has. And in California, I forget which does anybody know? California defeated both, I think, sports gambling, but the vice stuff happens that way. One state gets it, and then the other state is envious of the revenue, and then they say, well, we're going to have to suck it up and do it because we want the tax revenue. Abortion was interesting. Michigan and California both put Roe in their state constitutions, basically, in both states. California, not surprising. Michigan, Proposal 3 passed 57-43, which I'm sure helped Gretchen Whitmer retain her seat in Michigan. And it's interesting to see Michigan, which is a pretty Roman Catholic state and a pretty culturally conservative state, that number. In Kentucky, in Kentucky also, surprised, they rejected a measure that would have amended the state constitution to say that there is no right to abortion. So even in Kentucky, in Appalachia, the Roe effect was there. So let's go through the governors quickly. The Democrats flipped Maryland and Massachusetts, where Republicans were playing out of position. They had popular Republican governors in two of the most Democratic states in the country without super candidates. And they were term limited in Maryland and just retired in Massachusetts. Without those unicorn candidates, those were bound to happen anyway. The impressive holds for Democrats were Wisconsin, Michigan, Kansas, and Oregon. In all of those states, abortion is a factor. How these states handled these questions, we saw in Kansas, of course, in their primary, they had a referendum on the ballot that drew enormous turnout there. So Kelly in Kansas definitely owes something to that, but clearly so does Whitmer in Michigan. And in Wisconsin, to Rui's point, Tony Evers, he outperformed Mandela Barnes by 3 points, maybe, something like that. So we saw a lot of, one of the big stories of the election this year is how much ticket splitting went on. Now, there was a lot of undervoting where people just skipped over Senate races where you had wackadoodle candidates. But there was just a lot of ticket splitting in Georgia, in Pennsylvania especially, but you saw it all around the country, people passing over. Ohio, yeah. J.D. Vance, who sounded like he was a member of the Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Club in his concession speech. I was like, where's this guy? Where have you been all this time? But he trailed Mike DeWine by hundreds of thousands of votes in Ohio. And by the way, what those gubernatorial results in Georgia and in Pennsylvania and Ohio show, and New Hampshire, show two things. Republicans could have had the Senate. They could have had a 53-seat Republican Senate if they wouldn't have had weirdo candidates. That's very obvious. And the second thing that's clear is that the Republicans wasted so much stinking money. I mean, enough money to burn a wet elephant. They spent in Ohio, they spent money in Ohio, which is now a very Republican state, right? Ohio is very, or has been very Republican. They had to go in and bail out J.D. Vance, who couldn't raise any money. And Mike DeWine showed what the ceiling was like. I take real encouragement from the performance of, whatever you think of Ron DeSantis's politics, or whether you like him for president or not, leave that aside. Floridians think that he has done a good job as governor. They like the way that he handled coronavirus. They like the way he handled the schools. They like his positions on crime. They think, and so a lot of Democrats voted for Ron DeSantis, and he won among independents, as the results make it clear. He overwhelmingly won among independents. A guy who won his first term by a point wins a second term by 20 points. That's not just about Florida getting more Republican. That's about people like good government, right? And people respond to good government. And Ron DeSantis's performance in Florida is not a different story than the popularity of Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, or Larry Hogan in Maryland, or Republicans in Democratic states. People are still capable of choosing better choices. Governor's different. They'll send a kook to Washington before they will have one govern their own state. The sets of responsibilities are different. But I take real encouragement from these results and all of this ticket splitting. Okay, now that I've made you briefly optimistic, here to talk about the consequences of the election and what will happen next, Whit.
Chris, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be at AEI. So often AEI has been the voice of sanity in the midst of the maelstrom. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel. What happened? This should have been a red tsunami, like so many people were predicting. In our office, we were sitting there going, what kind of data are they looking at? We're not seeing the red tsunami, but a lot of people seem to see a red tsunami coming. I think it's a triumph of hope over data. But it should have been a tsunami. Why? Inflation is at a 40-year high. And inflation is fundamentally different from important but more abstract issues like the survival of democracy or climate change. It is a very tangible issue, hits every single voter every single day, and the overall inflation did not begin to measure the inflation in gas prices and groceries, which are two of the things that people feel most directly. So we had a 40-year high in inflation. We had crime, which was a real problem. It was not a trumped-up problem, so to speak. When you have Buckhead in Atlanta talking about pulling out of the city because people are scared to go to Lenox Mall because they're scared they'll get shot. Crime is a real issue that affects people very directly. And the border looks completely porous at the moment, and I guarantee you there was not an hour that passed on Fox News without another story about another group of migrants coming over the border. So those three issues alone should have led to a red tsunami. What happened? Why didn't it happen? The first reason is Dobbs. Overturning Roe versus Wade energized a whole lot of women. It particularly energized young people. The number one issue at 44% for young people under age 30 was abortion. So that really did change the dynamic, and it leveled the playing field on the enthusiasm meter. The other issue, even more important, which Roy has talked about, is the candidate quality. Donald Trump endorsed and got through a bunch of primaries, people who simply weren't ready for prime time. It is hard. It is really hard to run a high-profile Senate race with the eyes of the world on you if you've never done it before, you know? And like most of us, the first time we do something difficult, we probably don't do it as well as we do the second or third or fourth time. But there are a whole bunch of first-time candidates out there. We've mentioned, you know, Blake Masters in all kinds of places. Ohio, J.D. Vance managed to get through because of the Republican lean of the state. Pennsylvania, I mean, there are just so many places where they were not ready for prime time candidates. Now, half of my office consists of dyed-in-the-wool Georgia Bulldogs. I am not allowed to say a negative word about Herschel Walker. I think one of the guys has been wearing a Herschel Walker t-shirt since he was in kindergarten. Let's put it this way. A loaded 747 carries less baggage than Herschel Walker was trying to carry across the finish line in Georgia. I mean, it is pretty embarrassing. So the combination of Dobbs and the candidate quality meant that the red tsunami just did not happen. But I do think the Republicans will take over the House. It will be close. But it's kind of amazing to think about. With Joe Biden's job approval in the low 40s, Republicans should have had a huge advantage for presidents who have job approval below 50%. And this goes back to the Truman era. The average loss of House seats is 37. That's the average. The lowest loss of House seats for presidents who have job approvals less than 50% is 13. That happened in 2014 with Barack Obama. And the only reason they only lost 13 was that they lost everything they could have lost in 2010 when they lost 63 seats. So the lowest loss of a president's party below 50%, going back to Truman, is 13. We could actually beat that this year. It could actually be lower than 13. But I do think Republicans will eventually end up in control of the House. And so it behooves Republicans in the House to figure out why. The people who voted for Republican candidates for the House voted for somebody to do something about inflation, about crime, and about border security. Inflation, crime, and border security were the reasons why voters voted for Republican candidates for the House. What did they not vote for them to do? They most emphatically did not vote for them to ban all abortions nationally, to cut off aid to Ukraine, to engage in endless investigations of the Biden administration, and to whine about elections that they haven't won. Now, there's going to be a lot of pressure to do all four of those things instead of focus on inflation and crime and border security. And if they give into that pressure, as they may very well, they're going to create a backlash that's going to put the Democrats back in control in 2 years. The real challenge for our parties, both Democrats and Republicans, is governing where most people are, which is within shouting distance of the ideological center. But the pressure on both parties is so great that the Democrats tend to govern from the left, the Republicans from the right, and then the people in the middle come along and throw them out again because that's not what they were looking for. And so we end up with ping-pong government. 2006, we were disgusted with Iraq, we throw out the Democrats. We throw out the Republicans. 2010, upset about Obamacare, we throw out the Democrats. 2018, upset about Trump, throw out the Republicans. 2022, we're going to throw out the Democrats, at least in the House. So this ping-pong government's a function of getting into power and then governing from the wings rather than from the center where most people are. Let me make a couple other quick points, Chris, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Polling was pretty good this year. There were a few. There were a few high-profile misses, but for the most part, polling was pretty good. It was sort of like 2018, where polling was pretty good. Let's think about it this way. You know, if you looked at the polls, you would think that Brian Kemp was going to win comfortably in Georgia and the Senate race would be tied. Check. You would think that Josh Shapiro was going to win overwhelmingly in Pennsylvania for governor and Fetterman would win a narrow race. Check. That's what the polls said. You would know that Mike DeWine was going to win a landslide for governor in Ohio and J.D. Vance would win by single digits. Check. You would think that Bud in North Carolina would win a narrow victory based on polling, and he did. So the problem with polling is a Trump problem. It's a problem when Trump is on the ballot. And that's what we saw in 2016, 2020. It was a real problem. Polling had major issues. But this year, let's recognize that they actually did pretty well. Final point. Joe Biden owes Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger and the Republican Senate, the House and Senate in Georgia, an apology for calling their voter bill Jim Crow 2.0. I'm sorry, that's sheer demagoguery. Now, I will admit that most Democrats and in the mainstream media, am I redundant? Anyway, they
That's
tend
my
to,
joke.
They tend,
don't steal my material.
Sorry.
All right.
They tend to believe that any Republican bill is a bill designed to have voter suppression. But the fact remains that in 2018, 3.9 million Georgians voted. 3.9 is the highest in a century. When we get through counting this year, it's going to be closer to 4 million Georgians will have voted. So if it was a voter suppression bill, it was a disaster for trying to suppress the vote. Yeah, and I think calling that Jim Crow 2.0 is just demagoguery. So let me stop there and turn it over to you, and we'll go wherever anybody
That's right.
wants
If
to go.
everything is Jim Crow, nothing is
Let me
Jim
just
Crow.
ask, we have one question, it's about two regions that you poll in various places, certainly in the Southeast. You know, I think both in the Midwest and the Southeast, different problems for Republicans sort of knitting together two different coalitions, right? In the Mike DeWines and others who are really successful in the Midwest kind of have the old establishment, somewhat more college-educated whites, and they've picked up from the developments Republicans doing much better among white working-class whites, put them together. In the Southeast, maybe it's a little bit of a different coalition, but you have this sort of rising college-educated vote that used to be more Republican. You still have a strong white working-class vote. How do you see Republicans knitting those together, or what the challenges are for either knitting them together or dividing?
No, there's no question that education, particularly college education, is now a critical variable that we didn't used to see, 10 years ago. But there's another piece of the whole coalition, and that is the Republicans doing relatively better among non-white voters. And Kevin McCarthy, to his credit, has been recruiting a lot of more diverse Republican candidates to run. That's part of the message in the book that I wrote that Chris mentioned at the start, was the necessity to expand the Republican coalition into more Hispanic, African American, and Asian voters. We actually have made some progress on that score. And so I think if we have a candidate who doesn't have some of the pathologies that some of our recent candidates have had, there's a chance to continue that. Both Marco Rubio and Ron DeSantis won Miami-Dade County. That is a stunning statistic for Florida. And I think that bodes well for the Republican Party of the future if we have candidates who can reach out to those groups.
So that one of the consequences, and by the way, give Nate Moore something to do. He's just sitting here watching. Email your questions. If you're watching at home or in your office or wherever you are, Nate.Moore, M-O-O-R-E, at AEI.org. Nate.Moore at AEI.org. Get your questions in. We are almost to your questions, but we're going to hog it for just a little bit longer before we go to your questions here in the room. So be thinking about your brilliant and insightful questions, as we like to say. Please state your opinion in the form of a question. Whit and Rui and John, I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of a small majority for Republicans in the House. It's counterintuitive, or it seems contradictory, that the smaller the Republican majority, or Democrats, the crazier they will be. Because you would think more means more. But what happens is that in a smaller majority, the voices of the most extreme are louder, right? Because if you can only afford, if there's 40 members of the Freedom Caucus, the MAGA caucus, then they have veto power over everything you want to do. You don't have any cushion, and this puts McCarthy in a very difficult position. Whit, what do you think? I've heard it all before from Republicans. This time is different, right? After they smashed in the windows at the Capitol and tried to kill Mike Pence, they said, okay, now we've learned our lesson. We're going to back away from the crazy stuff and we're going to get legit. And this week I'm reading in the New York Post and the Wall Street Times, and I'm hearing all the people, or the Wall Street Journal, I'm hearing all of the people say, like, well, now they've learned their lesson. But then I read someplace else that the Freedom Caucus is going to have Tucker Carlson come in to talk to them for their first.
That'll calm things down.
Yeah, that'll just settle everybody right down over there. How do you see, Whit, starting with you, how do you see this Republican majority in the House behaving?
how I would like it to behave is to concentrate on inflation and crime and border security.
Well, I would like it if pork rinds had no calories,
Right,
but that's
right.
that's not been my luck.
Exactly. I mean, if passed as prologue, this small House majority will govern from the right and will get engaged in all these investigations and cut off Ukraine aid and, try to ban abortion and do all these other things that will repel a majority of the country and put the Democrats back in charge. I hope that that is not correct, but I see no reason to think that we're going to have an outcome any different from what we've had in past elections.
So, Rui, Joe Biden, as you already pointed out, said, what are we going to do differently? Nothing. What are you going to change? Nothing. I'm happy where I am. I am reminded of his old boss, Barack Obama, who, after 2010 and the shellacking that they took, pressed right ahead, right? Just plowed right ahead. Why can't anybody remember how successful Bill Clinton was in, you say, oh, we've heard the message, right? We've heard the message. Certainly Donald Trump didn't take any message from the 2018 results. Why is this all we're going to get? Or are we going to see something different out of Democrats this time?
Well, we shall see, but I do think there are a lot of forces pushing the Democrats in the direction of not taking their problems seriously. I mean, just why don't they take things out of Bill Clinton's playbook? Look, the median Democratic activist, it's a very liberal, relatively liberal party now. They look back in the Clinton years as an era of betrayal, of the most awful, grotesque politics that we progressive Democrats cannot possibly, pay any attention to. He was always trying to persuade people of things, basically screw persuasion. We just want to get our people out there to vote and look at how successful we were in this election. So I think that, I think 2024 as it comes into focus, and the Senate map is incredibly bad for the Democrats in 2024. I didn't even touch on that, but there's this wide variety of red and purple states Democrats have to defend seats in. I just think that, the signals of the marketplace may come through and eventually concentrate the mind a little bit among Democrats, but I think their initial reaction to this particular election is not going to be toward change, as President Biden has so clearly indicated, but rather toward patting themselves on the back and saying, well, hey, that went pretty well, right? Let's just keep rocking. So I think that's the short-term thing, but I think we're very early in the 2024 cycle, very early, it can't be any earlier. And I think that, as we get closer to that election and the nature of things, the electoral environment comes into focus, and particularly if Republicans, at least sort of get their act together, that puts pressure on them to sort of get their act together. But, I guess bottom line is I'm not too optimistic in the short term about how much things are going to.
It's been a pretty safe bet in Washington for some time. That's been
that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
John?
I will say, I mentioned before, obviously, the closer it is, the potential for some sort of leadership fight. And it seemed like Kevin McCarthy really was going to avoid that. If it's really, really close, it could be a mess. And if you really want to, look into how bad a mess it could be, you could look at the 19th century. There's Charles Stewart and Jeff Jenkins have a book called Fighting for Speakership. You can look and find these times where we went months without a speaker. We had all sorts of problems. I'm not predicting that, but that is something, if it's very, very close, we watch for. The one thing that cuts against it is they're not in a governing position, right? I mean, it's useful to put forward your agenda, but they are in the minority. And so holding people together in the minority is often easier, and I think that will. A narrow majority coming out with a future Republican president is a real issue. And then the other thing I will say is during the budget times is when we're really going to see it. If we are really asking a Republican narrow majority Congress to raise the debt ceiling or to pass appropriations bills, it's going to be very difficult holding together. That's the one time in the minority you still really are going to have to do that. One last point. I actually think it probably does make it harder to push forward on impeachment. I mean, you've had, both sides have pushed their people to impeach the presidents, and the leadership has generally wanted to hold them back. And if you have a small majority, it obviously is harder to actually get everybody together, which you're going to need to do.
Oh, there you go. There's something.
So I'm optimistic.
What do you think the chances are that they will, in a more specific version of your point about the leadership fight, Steve Scalise has declared for majority leader. He says he's not going to go fight. And Steve Scalise, who has been the whip, is the guy who, if it's not McCarthy, is the next most logical choice. All the reports are that the former president is breaking the crockery down at Mar-a-Lago and having a very unhappy rest of his week. What do you think the possibilities are that Trump parachutes in and screws up the speakership for Kevin McCarthy?
Well, I'm not sure he wants to or not. I mean, in a way, they seem to have made up a little bit, and I think that was going okay. What I think the problem is if you have just 3, 4 wild cards, there's no obvious challenger to McCarthy. There's not somebody who says, "Oh, I'm going to come up and be the person who unite everybody." It's just that you can't unite around anyone. And so if someone says, "We're not going to let Kevin McCarthy be speaker," it sort of opens everything up to a sort of square one chaos where you have to start and find somebody new.
Jim Jordan's getting Chick-fil-A delivered to his house by Kevin McCarthy right now, right at this. Jim, just wanted to make sure you're doing great. Just having a great day. Okay, are you emailing your questions to nate.moore@aei.org? I hope you are, but we'll start in the room. We'll begin right here in this very magical space. Right here. Oh, wait, we're going to start here. We'll come to you, I promise. And I'm going to continue to say words while you carry a microphone over to this gentleman. It's happening. It's all happening. Thank you for your great question. Now there's a lot of pressure on you. It's got to be really good now that there's been all this buildup.
Thank you each for speaking. There's been a lot of talk around, the candidates on the Republican side, just being weak with this election. Maybe it was because they're election to lose. But what about in Pennsylvania? You have someone who can form a complete sentence and someone who had trouble doing that within an election. So I'm just curious your thoughts on Fetterman.
Well, you were Mr. Senate.
Right. Well, Mehmet Oz may be more articulate than John Fetterman. I think that wasn't much of a contest, but he also had enormous liabilities, right? I mean, he was viewed as a carpetbagger. He was viewed as, in many people's sense, a crazy Trumpy kind of candidate. And just the fact that he was a slick talker wasn't going to be enough. I think a lot of Republicans did talk themselves into believing that Fetterman was so obviously flawed, especially after the stroke, that how could people possibly vote for him? But I think that sort of ignored the underlying liabilities and vulnerabilities of a candidate like Oz, who comes out of nowhere. I mean, actually, I think there was a little exit poll data point on this, which is, how serious a problem is it that John Fetterman, has these health problems, whatever, and it was X amount, and then X plus 10 amount thought that the fact Mehmet Oz wasn't from Pennsylvania was an even bigger problem. So it was sort of a deal breaker. So that tells you something right there about how people were interpreting the election and dealing with Fetterman versus Oz. I mean, was Fetterman, were people disturbed about his health problems? I think they were, but it just wasn't enough for a sufficient number of them to decide I'm going to vote for Oz over Fetterman, even though I really detest Oz and think he's
and not dissimilar to the Georgia experience, right, where there are a lot of Republicans who would not want Herschel Walker to be their best friend, were willing to vote for him. For the partisanship is a hell of a drug, and it really it helps people get past a lot of things. Okay,
Chris, let me just make a point. Yeah. If Fetterman had withdrawn after his stroke and they'd installed Connor Lamb as the nominee, it would have been over.
Right, I think he would have crushed him.
The race would have been over.
Yeah,
totally.
I mean, I was going to add that. Look, I think that it's not clear that it hurt Fetterman at all, but. In a way, it had a weird dynamic in the race in that Fetterman is not as strong a candidate, I think, as some are portraying him. He does have this ability to appeal to white working class, but he's a Bernie guy. He's pretty left on certain things, and we didn't really scrutinize him in a certain way because of him being off the campaign trail. And so the full Fetterman, healthy, might not have been as strong a candidate as you think. And,
That's right.
This was an interesting dynamic.
That's a great point. Connor Lamb would have been a better choice for them, regardless of Fetterman's health problems. Nate Moore, what do we got? What's cooking on the old internet machine?
Someone online is wondering, what was the correlation between the top of state tickets and the House elections? How about in the states with unsuccessful Trump acolytes at the top of the Republican slate? Did they drag down other Republicans?
John, did you see any evidence of that?
I like the very personal someone online who's asked this. So
it's Nate's mom. Don't make a big deal out of it. We needed help.
Wants to know.
As I mentioned, the swing wasn't even. There were definitely different places, but you look at places like Michigan. Michigan, again, I think the Democrats had some good incumbents who withstood trends. Republicans had a bad candidate in one of the districts. They might have done better, but the whole state seemed to move. And so, whether it was just the top of the ticket, Governor Whitmer, or the abortion referendum, or more broadly, some issues that brought out college-educated whites in a certain way, in a stronger way. I mean, you did see this kind of trend that pulled people across the way. One other maybe counterexample slightly is, Virginia actually, Republicans did pretty well in Virginia, broadly speaking, in a lot of districts, even the ones we weren't paying attention to. Abigail Spanberger just went against trend. She did a lot better. Of course, you have Jennifer Wexner winning, but winning by a very small amount in a very strongly Biden district, and of course, Elaine Luria losing. So you saw, strong movement in some direction. There was no top of the ticket race, but going against the other way. So I think you see it in some states.
Did we have any states?
New York,
did we have any states where you had a weak or MAGA-y Senate candidate and no governor running? I can't think of one. They were all in harness, right? Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Georgia, all had both, right? So maybe the answer to Nate's mom is that we don't have a good test, because in a lot of these states, you also had a strong gubernatorial candidate who would have helped too. So it's hard to say. Okay, let's do one more online and then we'll come back to the room.
I've got a name this time. Nick is wondering, assuming the Republicans win the majority, will Nancy Pelosi, after her current term, step aside, or will she continue to serve as minority leader? What else might happen within the Democratic leadership?
She's got to want to go, doesn't she?
Yeah, I guess my expectation is she will step down, though I'm not really privy to any inside information on that, which means Hakeem Jeffries will probably be the next minority leader. And if he is, I think it's an interesting question how he's going to handle the caucus and some of the issues that we've been discussing in terms of, do the Democrats literally change nothing, or do they try to take a little bit of a different approach? I think Jeffries is a very smart politician, and I think he's not unaware of a lot of these problems. And I have a little bit more faith that he would try to do something than Pelosi, who I think was basically stuck in her own unstable equilibrium, on her party that's stuck in an unstable equilibrium. She just wanted to manage things, get through, and now probably retire. But I think Jeffries might have a broader point of view and be more willing to do some stuff to kind of have a more productive relationship within the caucus.
You can see all three leaders stepping aside, I think. The top three, in a way, hanging around as not
Clyburn,
speakers, Clyburn and Hoyer.
Who would replace Clyburn, do you think?
That's a good question, but I agree with you. Hakeem Jeffries seems like a very strong person to wipe away the current leadership and move to somebody new. I think the one weird situation would be the Democrats holding on by one seat, and that's a crazy situation as well, and one where perhaps the party says, well, let's go back to Nancy Pelosi. You have to stay. But
one more time, Cincinnati.
Tried and tested.
I think, Whit, that it's probably true that if you're in the minority, if you have a big minority, there's similar effects to having a small majority, which is to say that the bigger the minority, the louder voices like Abigail Spanberger are going to be, because because normally what happens is when you lose in a wave election, who loses? Moderates lose, because they're in swing districts. They're suburban districts. There are people like Abigail Spanberger. There are people like Elise Slotkin and other. They get wiped out. They go out with the tide. So I suppose that there's reason to think that Rui is onto something with that things might go a little bit better for Democrats and minority.
Maybe.
You're not going to let. I keep trying to elbow you into positivity, but I can't get there. But we're going to do it before we're done. Ma'am, you've had your hand up here.
Right behind you is the microphone.
Thank you very much. All of you, I think, have referenced Biden's low approval ratings. I'd like to challenge you to think of them as high approval ratings. Biden had virtually no coattails when he was elected. He had the smallest majority in the Senate possible, and the smallest pretty much majority in the House. He really wasn't very popular. The Elizabeth Warren people, the Bernie Sanders people, the Buttigieg people.
Okay.
Basically, he was a suck-up candidate. People voted for him because he was there.
Okay, what's your
So
question?
the question is, how does that go forward to result in people over 75 not running for president?
Oh, what do we do about the fact that our national leadership has the approximate median age of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No, but both
I was gonna
Elizabeth
say we're gonna have
Warren, but both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So there's a whole cohort that would like to see none of the above.
It ain't the Pepsi generation. This is a fact.
And we are going to have about the quietest birthday celebration for a president ever
Yeah,
in about
exactly.
2 weeks. So
Exactly.
What? How old
What,
is
who,
he
me?
again?
No, it's fine. You didn't have to do anything.
Well, the good Lord has a way of getting rid
Yes,
of
I was going to
some of
say.
All right.
There are organic solutions to these questions. And I would also just say, intergenerational conflict is not new, right? Baby boomers forget that their parents hated them. Oh my gosh, it wasn't like that the silent generation and greatest generation said, man, I love you guys dropping acid and going down in the basement and playing psychedelic music records. You guys are fantastic. I loved it when you burned your draft cards. So this kind of intergenerational conflict that we're experiencing between the baby boom and the millennial group, the millennials are now the largest single cohort, right? Is that true?
That's true.
Yep.
So we're in a push me, pull me phase, and it will resolve itself in the next little bit here.
But
We're gonna-
one other thing to say is, though, Joe Biden was in a worse position back in the spring. I mean, he was down
Yeah.
in the 30s, and it was really terrible. And that's when you started hearing the voices of, will someone challenge him? And that's died down over the summer. And with this election, I think it dies down even more. So I know people may have it in the back of their
Biden seems
heads,
pretty
but
cocky
they're
right
yeah,
now,
he
though.
does.
I
He
think
does.
did.
Like, hey, I'm ready.
That's one of the advantages. Okay, one more in the room in the back. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Morgan. I'm a freelance journalist and analyst. I've been in conversation with some of my colleagues online, and they had the impression that one of the biggest losers in this is Glenn Youngkin. With what?
I saw that article. Washington
Yeah.
Post had a piece, talked about it.
Yes, so basically, is that true or not? And secondly, you were talking about referendums about abortion. You didn't mention 131 in Montana and that language.
That's true.
I was wondering what your thoughts about that were as well.
In Montana, it's a Born Alive Act that if any child who is born is protected, and that passed in Montana. The Glenn Youngkin question is, so the rap on Youngkin is he campaigned for a bunch of candidates who
Some of
lost,
them didn't win.
but a bunch of candidates lost. I think the biggest winner of the night was the biggest winner this week's Ron DeSantis. Period. He blew the doors off Charlie Crist down in Florida. He outperformed Rubio, and he did it after Trump snubbed him and called him Ron DeSanctimonious.
I thought that was a Roman 6. Nobody knows what sanctimonious means.
It was like
picked a simpler
right. It was
word
like
or
showing a New Yorker cartoon at a pro wrestling match. It was a miss. I think Trump is the big loser. I don't think Youngkin is hurt in any material way, and potentially helped in this sense, which is if Republicans have made a decision that they are ready to try to persuade voters and reach out to swing voters, Glenn Youngkin was the first one through the gate, right? He was the first Republican candidate after 2020 to say, here's another way to do this and try to persuade instead of just appeal to the base. Does anybody have a different opinion about Glenn Youngkin?
No, I agree with that. It's important to understand the current divisions within the Republican Party. About 10% of the Republican Party are never Trumpers. They never voted for Trump. They didn't approve of his job performance. They're appalled that he came and took over the party. They like to think it's larger than 10%, but we've done a lot of polling on that subject. It's not. About 40% of the party are always Trumpers. They will walk through a wall of flame for Donald Trump. He hung the moon. He is the best guy that has ever come down the pike in politics. Criticizing Donald Trump with always Trump voters is like criticizing Jesus in an evangelical church. You can criticize him all you want. It's not going to change the view of Jesus or Donald Trump. but it'll sure trash the reputation of whoever says something negative about him. About 50% of the party are maybe Trumpers. These are people who voted for him twice, they approved of his job performance, they would vote for him again in a heartbeat against Joe Biden, but they're not at all sure they want to go back to all the drama and the divisions in their family, between marriages, within marriages, with friends, and they're open to somebody else.
It is
That doesn't mean
exhausting.
they will go to somebody else, but they are open to somebody else. And that's where a Ron DeSantis or a Glenn Youngkin comes in. They're at least going to give them a look. That's half the party. Now, the other part of this equation is how many people get into the race. Because if it's DeSantis and Youngkin versus Trump, it's a completely different race than if it's a dozen other people and Trump. Because 40% goes a long way in a primary, and he's got the 40.
John, we saw Tom Cotton early, before even the voting started, or the voting stopped, say that he was dropping out. And he was on that long list with Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley and a bunch of people who were going to audition to be the MAGA without the Trump, a more populistic, working class oriented, maybe a little more protectionism, maybe a little more isolationism, and Cotton bowed out. Does that, do you think, John, speak to a Republican Party that has learned from that if you have 22 candidates, it's not a good fit?
Well, I actually think it is part of the dynamic that there still is some worry and fear about challenging Donald Trump from people who might be in the same lane as him. I think with the election, it's lessened. I mean, he made this announcement slightly before, but somebody might have to do it. And I think the biggest question is for DeSantis. Back to the Youngkin question, whoever, if someone runs directly against Trump, you're going to get portrayed to some extent as the non-Trump candidate, right? And so, can you keep a foot in the Trump world? And DeSantis seems like he has a little bit better mix of having a foot into Trump voters as well as the non-Trump voters. Youngkin, I think, potentially falls into the category of, well, maybe he's not, maybe he needs a little more pizzazz among the Trump voters. He seems like he's playing that up a little bit too much and not really working on that other side.
The fleece vest is powerful.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to the internet. What, Nate Moore, do we have? What's going on?
One more. If the Republicans had nominated more centrist or non-MAGA candidates, wouldn't most of the MAGA Republicans just have stayed home and the Republicans would have lost anyway?
See, I think that Witt is correct here. I think that for most Republicans, right, they would vote for Donald Trump, but they also would have voted for Chris Christie, or they would have voted for Marco Rubio, or they would have voted for Ted Cruz, that the partisanship trumps, no pun intended, that is what is important. There are, I found that there was 20%, I know about the 40 you're talking about, but then there's another, the really hardcore, and I found them when we were polling about Trump was in a vicious fight with the family of a soldier who was killed in Iraq. And they were in he was in a Twitter war with a Gold Star family. And Republicans, smart Republicans like Witt were like, don't do that. That's not a good thing to do. People don't like that. And there was 20% in a poll that we did when I was at Fox and in other surveys elsewhere that said, keep going, keep fighting with these people. So there are people inside the Republican Party who love the worst parts about Trump, right? They love the pugilism, they love the anger, they love that stuff, and they feed on it, right? Because it is good TV, it's super entertaining, and if you feel like that you have been victimized, if you feel like the mainstream media, you feel like the Democratic Party, and you feel like elites, and you feel like all these people have been victimizing you and others, what's appealing about Trump is what? He's angry. There's a scene in All the King's Men, the Broderick Crawford version, of course, never the Sean Penn version, sorry. And in the book, where Willie Stark is there and he is glistening with sweat and the torches are lit, and he's talking about all the enemies of the crowd that have come to save him from impeachment. And he says, give me that meat axe, because he's gonna tear into them like a side of beef, and the crowd goes crazy. That kind of anger is really powerful for people who feel victimized. And the Republican Party has a problem, which is that feels too good for those people. Now, I think in most of these cases, they'd have come out and vote for David McCormick instead of Mehmet Oz, and I think they would have come out to vote for, I don't know, who would the Georgia nominee could have been? Some normal, boring guy.
There's not always a better, not always a great alternative.
I feel with
That's part of
Herschel
the
Walker,
issue.
somebody probably could have been it. There isn't, but
Could have been you, John.
they would have come out to vote for Jane Timken instead of J.D. Vance, and they did.
Right.
I think in most of the cases it wouldn't have made the difference. But the Republicans do have to acknowledge that there is this white hot anger in there that Trump is really good at speaking to, and that rage addiction is a real thing, and it can be defeated.
I might add from the Democratic side, you have a somewhat similar dynamic, right? I mean, if you advocate that the Democrats should move to the center on various issues that would reduce their vulnerabilities, a lot of people will say, well, if we do that, the progressives won't vote, the base won't vote, they won't show up. Hispanic voters won't vote, black voters, and I think this is ludicrous. I mean, I think they would be happy to vote for a more centrist Democrat. The idea that they're all going to stay home and, rage against the machine, I just think is incorrect. There's not a lot of evidence for it. And to some extent, this is like a sort of house of cards created by a lot of the activist groups who purport to represent these constituencies, right? We represent the black voters. We represent the Hispanic voters. We represent, everybody, I mean, who's sort of remotely Democratic, and they don't. They represent their agenda, and the fact of the matter is the Democrats it would be a good trade-off for the Democrats to move to the center on a lot of the issues that are currently vexing them, because you would gain more through persuasion and reaching people in the center than you would lose from a few people who would stay home. But the idea they're all going to stay home, and in fact that the progressive activist groups have the power to make them stay home, or it's just not right. I mean, these people, they live in the real world. They know what their choices are, and most of them are going to come out and vote for the party they prefer and are generally simpatico with, regardless of whether it's a little more centrist or not. So I do think that the dynamic takes place on both sides. And the reason why a lot of progressives won't put up with this, it gets back to your white hot anger thing. They are so furious at Trump, at the Republican Party, at the ultra mega MAGA who are going to institute fascism in the United States, and they're all racist and they're bigots, and they just can't stand it. We can't compromise. We can't throw anybody under the bus. We cannot have a different approach on anything. Like, our leader Joe Biden says we should change nothing because we are right, they are wrong, they're hateful, they're bigoted, they're racist, they want to destroy democracy, and we have to hold the line. But it's predicated on a theory of the case electorate, which I think is incorrect, and I think that's basically what Witt is.
The only thing I'd push back on is this. Sometimes when people say we want these centrist candidates, I mean, a really centrist candidate in the Republican Party is not in the middle of the party, and the candidates that did really well were the ones who, even being attacked by Trump, essentially didn't respond to it. I mean, Brian Kemp, Raffensperger, to some extent Mike DeWine and others, they went to have certainly a conservative, not even a somewhat Trump-like agenda. If you see Brian Kemp's early ads or what he ran on and what he's for, he's a pretty conservative guy, and yet he didn't engage as I'm an anti-Trump person. He didn't admit it. He just went forward and did his thing. And that's kind of a better model, I think, than sort of real centrists or Rockefeller Republicans or something that just doesn't
Rockefeller
fit.
Republican. And there is a phrase.
Yes,
I'm old enough.
There's exactly. Yes,
I remember.
But I think you're exactly right. Now, I don't want to ignore the Danes, because if you ignore the Danes, sooner or later you see the sails on the horizon, and then you're really in trouble.
And you've had your own election too, so right
Exactly.
coming off
So
of that.
we're the Dane Gelt is coming. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the conversation here. It's great to hear. If you were an election denier, the election was pretty bad. Some of the certain states they won, but all the swing states it seemed that they lost. Are we now done talking about election deniers? Is that a chapter that is behind us, or will it come back?
No.
Yeah.
No.
It'll come back.
But the election deniers don't want to stop talking about
Right.
election denying because it's kind of their thing now. And Democrats basically love to talk about election deniers, and so does the media, right? It's like a big story. There's always going to be people out there saying these things, and despite the fact that nobody really stormed the barricades in this election, despite the fact that Republicans way underperformed and election deniers way underperformed what they thought, nobody seems to be out there, with the flaming torches trying to destroy democracy. So, but I think that it's irresistible for both sides, I think, to talk about.
And we should remember also that Republican disbelief in election results is a longstanding part of Republican orthodoxy. Certainly dates back to the 1960 election, and then long before that with big city machine politics and the Republican belief that they steal elections in big cities. By the way, they used to. And Republican machines in big cities did too. Bill Thompson in Chicago was just as big of a crook as any of the Democratic machines in Chicago. So, and he was hanging out with Al Capone. So that was not a particularly wholesome time. Belief in widespread election fraud is part of the Republican DNA. What happened is that usually relatively quiet grumbling turned into this bonfire, right? Turned into this giant thing. And the very best thing that happened this year, two great things happened this year. I already mentioned the one great thing, which is all that ticket splitting and all the people saying, you know, the defining statistic for this election, when Gallup did its last study about voter attitudes about the parties, they were both flunked. 35%, they tied at 35% favorable views of both of the parties. So people looked at the Democrats and they said, the inflation's out of control, the crime is a problem, I want to do something else. And then they looked over at the Republicans and said, not you again, I can't do that again. So they were caught between choices that they did not like, and they split their ballots up. We won't know the final numbers on ticket splitting until we get to the end, but that's the first great good news. The other good news, which is really great, which is this was a pretty smooth run, right? I sat all night in Chicago waiting for the first reports of torches at the gates of the Maricopa County. It was fine. Everything went pretty smoothly. Every election cycle, there's lawsuits. Every election cycle, there's complaints. Every election cycle. I loved in Maricopa County, by the way. Did you see what the problem was in Maricopa County? They had 20% of the polling places were having trouble early in the day. Did you see what the problem was? They didn't put the right size on the printer to run the paper through. And somebody was like, change it to 11, and they're like, oh, okay, da-da-da-da. And they ran them off, and it was fine.
But your point is very much on the point that election denials is not a particular popular point of view right now. I mean, look in Arizona. Kari Lake is a very polished, very cool, very smooth candidate on the Republican side for governor. Katie Hobbs is not. and the fact that is even close, I think, is a function of people making a negative judgment about Kari Lake's election denialism. So it's a losing message for most Americans, but we'll see whether or not they'll keep it on. It makes a huge difference when a president of the United States is the one carrying the message. That's what's different about this current environment.
But John, isn't it also true that no one, to Rui's point, no one loves talk of election denialism more than the mainstream press and the Democratic Party. It is their single favorite topic. And I always remind people, like 20% of Americans believe in Bigfoot, right? A lot of people, and I'm sorry to offend any Bigfoot believers here with us today, any Sasquatch or skunk. Yeah, exactly, watch it. I identify as a Sasquatch. But John, that people hold a lot of views. What we've seen a lot of, in addition to Republicans having crazy ideas, is a real emphasis on this in the press and by Democrats, right?
No, I think Rory's right that it is loved by, in some ways, both sides, and it is ratcheted up. I also agree with your point that the election has been run relatively smoothly. Not to warn too much, we still have a lot of ballots out there in California, and I don't think it's going to turn one house or the other, but if we have a close race, we're going to count them, and we're going to start to see the types of things that people start to argue about again. I hope it's more of a normal partisan fight over a recount rather than sort of blowing it up to the levels of high drama on this. But yeah, I think Democrats are happy to have that as an issue. Yeah.
Right. I would like to see things get back to, hey, let's just beat the other side.
Right.
You know?
Well, and the most important election is always the next election, right?
Right.
It's true. That's the beauty of the American. If we look back at history, the two single most significant American elections are 1800 and 1864. In 1800, the very open question about whether the hated, and you cannot overstate the hatred that John Adams had for Thomas Jefferson. It was the white-hot passion of 10,000 Suns. And here comes Thomas Jefferson, and he's going to replace him as president. And America held its breath, right? Can we really do this? Will an incumbent president step aside and let this person who has said every bad thing about him ever, can he really do it? And we did. And then in 1864, in the middle of a civil war, when Abraham Lincoln could have, and there were radical Republicans in the Congress who would have told him that he was well within his rights to do it. This is no time to have an election. We're in a civil war. We can't be doing this. And Abraham Lincoln not only stood for re-election, but it was the votes of troops ultimately who were the ones that his opponent said, bring them home, right? He was running against a general he had fired. And the guy who said the troops want to come home, it was the votes of the army that carried Lincoln over the top. So we've had some amazing elections in the past, but the most important election in American history is always the next election, because if you don't like what happened, if you're a Republican, you don't like what happened this week, 2 years from now, you get to do it again. That's the beauty of this system, and that's what Rui's talking about, and that's what we forgot. That's what we're tending to forget right now, which is, what are you supposed to say? When the other side wins, you say, you got us this time, we'll be back next time. It's a healthy rivalry that can be good for us, not the kind of rivalry that poisons us.
And the peaceful transfer of power is the fundamental cornerstone of a democratic system.
It is our great inheritance.
And that's why the last presidential election was so different from anything else that's happened in 230 years and is such a threat to the system.
Mm-hmm. Do we have?
And the most important election watch is the next election
Hey-oh.
watch, which will not happen this cycle, but we will be back in 2024 with as we have for many, many years, a longer cycle in a presidential year with all sorts of interesting things, but we don't have dates for you.
Will there be
but
prizes for
we will, sure.
Rui, you're the prize. Just getting to hear your wisdom is the prize. But yes, John is very right, and I want to thank you guys and John and the American Enterprise Institute always for providing a forum like this. I will just point out that in America today, there's not a lot of places that you can go and hear a conversation with different points of view that is fairly conducted, and people are unafraid to disagree. People are unafraid to hear things that they disagree with, and that we can do it civilly and have lunch. That's not bad, right? So I thank you guys all for being here. I thank you all for having it, and we will be back for the next cycle. Have a great day.